My name is Adam Szabados, and I'm here with Leonardo De Chirico, Italian theologian. He is the pastor of the church Breccia di Roma, chair of the Theological Commission of the Italian Evangelical Alliance, director of Reformanda Initiative, author of a number of books related to Roman Catholicism, and probably a lot more. And we will be talking about Leonardo's recent book, Engaging with Thomas Aquinas, an evangelical approach. So, ciao, Leonardo.
Ciao.
This is the second book that I have recently read on Thomas. The other one was G.K. Chesterton's St. Thomas Aquinas, which is an enthusiastic, rather longish essay on this giant theologian from the 13th century. And your book is the other one, which is more academic. It was published by Apollos. But I would say it's also quite accessible, at least for a general theological public. You don't have to be an Aquinas expert to read it. And there is a blurb at the back of it written by Kevin Van Hooser, who says, readers will find here wise, charitable, yet cautionary advice. And I agree with this assessment. And I guess my first question to you is, why, after writing on the Papacy, writing on Mariology, why did you choose Aquinas for your topic?
Well, thank you very much, Adam, for this opportunity. I think there are two main reasons. One is more of a distant reason. The other is a more approximate reason. The proximate one is that this year and next year, the important centenaries are going to be celebrated. Thomas Aquinas died in 1274, so 750 years ago. And he was born in 1225. So next year, they're going to celebrate the 8th centenary. So, and in the Catholic, academic, philosophical world, there are going to be a number of initiatives, books, conferences on Thomas Aquinas, and because of these centenaries, conferences. And so I thought it was appropriate to have an evangelical voice contributing to these centenaries. That's approximate. But of course, you cannot invent a book on Aquinas in 1 or 2 years. That is part of my lifelong research on Catholicism. So Aquinas has been a dialogue partner for 25 years, trying to study Catholicism. It is inevitable to encounter Thomas Aquinas along the way, both in medieval debates, in Reformation debates, post-Reformation debates, modern debates, contemporary debates. Wherever you go, if you study Catholicism, you will encounter in one way or another. So that's the more distant reason, and precipitated by the more proximate reason related to the centenaries.
Now, most of us generally are more familiar with anecdotes from St. Francis of Assisi from the same century, about whom Chesterton also wrote a book. Are there any anecdotes or interesting facts about St. Thomas Aquinas that bring him closer to us?
Yeah. Well, less so than St. Francis, but he was by Albert the Great, his master. He was nicknamed the dumb ox.
Why dumb?
Because apparently he was not a talkative person, at least as far as his youthful years. And Ox, because apparently he was a big boy, at least as far as when he was a student. So he was a silent, a thoughtful young student. But then he added the second part of the sentence, but when he will speak, the whole world will hear him. And that has become part of the anecdotic life of Thomas. The other very curious thing was, there are many other instances, but the other instance is when he was, after becoming a Dominican friar, his family didn't like the choice and tried to even kidnap him from stopping him from pursuing that path. And they locked him in a room when he was still very young and let a lady in, a naked lady, trying to touch him and seduce him. That was their way to try to stop him, and he resisted that temptation. And then another anecdote that is when, at the very end of his life, when he was in Naples, he had an ecstatic vision, and after that ecstatic mystical experience, he came back saying, in the light of what I saw, everything that I wrote so far is like straw. And he asked his faithful secretary, Reginald of Piperno, to destroy all of his books and manuscripts. Of course, he didn't. But that is another interesting...
I read it on page 25, and I was going to ask about it. So what do you make of this mystical experience?
Well, he was used to... He was not the first one. He was... part of his spirituality blended academic, sophisticated debates as well as contemplative practices. So that line was not crossed only once. In those years, if you think of St. Francis, or if you think of his contemporary in the Franciscan order, Bonaventure, they all lived lives going here and there, crossing the line of the mystical experience.
Was it typical of Dominicans?
And Franciscans, because Bonaventure was a Franciscan monk. That speaks of the fact that reality was underlined by Pope Francis in last year at a Thomistic Congress that took place in Rome. And Pope Francis, as we know, is not an academic theologian, so you would not have expected him to endorse Thomas as a theologian per se, ivory tower theologian. But he stressed in his address to the Congress, he stressed the fact that Thomas is an example of what it means to be a mystic and a theologian. And that he said, this is what we need now. Not ivory tower theologians, but we need mystical people. And what he meant is open to discussion, but that is the way he appreciated it.
Is the fact that he was referred to, or is referred to as Doctor Angelicus or Doctor Angelicus, the angelic doctor, does it have to do anything with this?
In a sense, yes. In another sense, he is called Doctor Angelicus because he grasped, in the way in which he is perceived, he grasped the heavenly realities and was able to convey them in a thoughtful, scholastic, academic way. So he embraced the sophistications of lofty thoughts and then wrote about them in his multiple works.
So Thomas is the author of many works. If I remember correctly, you said he wrote like 8 million words?
Yes.
So it's a lot.
There are three ways in which he wrote. One, directly himself. Then he dictated. Generally speaking, he had a very interesting way of dictating. He had two secretaries at the same time, so he would dedicate half an hour to one, dictating one thing, and then half an hour to the other one, dictating on other topics. And then thirdly, we have his students who have taken notes of his lectures and then published them. So the whole of this giant work comes from these three ways of actually writing, dictating, and reporting.
And the two most important works or summaries are his two summae. Can you tell us about that? What are those about, and what are the distinctions between the two?
Yeah, the Summa against the Gentiles and the Summa Theologia or Theologia, depending on how you pronounce the Latin. In the scholastic period, in the 13th century, the literary genre of writing summae, that is summaries, full accounts of things, had become quite widespread. And so Thomas was part of that intellectual climate. He understood his role also in terms of writing academic textbooks for students. And the summas were considered to be textbooks, manuals, or reference works. And the Summa Against the Gentiles is a book divided in 4 chapters, where it grapples with how we can know God in our conversation with Jews and Muslims, because that was his world was made of Christendom, Europe, and then the Jews, of course, and the Muslims who were around.
Has he had encounters with Muslims?
No, not direct encounters.
Not directly. Unlike Francis.
Unlike Francis, who traveled to Egypt. But no, Thomas did travel, but to Cologne, Paris, back to Italy, again to Paris, back to Italy, and then he died. He wasn't an international traveler like Francis, but the Muslims were certainly part of his picture of the world, and so he wanted to, especially because in his time, some Arab commentators of Aristotle, Avicenna and Averroes, they were popular academic sources and authors that in European universities were read and were becoming influential. And so he thought that it was his task to tackle the issue of whether or not we can know God by having these authors as reference points. And then the other source that was becoming widespread was Maimonides, the Jewish commentator of Aristotle. So we had this renaissance in Aristotelian thought mediated by 2 Arab commentators and 1 Jewish commentator. And that was becoming the standard scientific philosophical discourse. So as a philosopher, theologian, he wanted to engage with what can we know from these philosophical sources, mediating Aristotle through Arab and Jewish voices. And so he divided the book in 4, the work in 4 books. The first 3 books are related to what we can know from reason, and that is in common with Jewish and Arab Muslim thinkers. 3 books. So we can, and he ends up by saying that we can, by using natural reason shared with these different authors, we can know that God exists and God is one.
I had a Muslim student once, and he gave me a booklet that proved the existence of God.
Yeah.
And as I was reading it, I thought I was like, it was like reading Aquinas.
Aquinas, yes. But that was also the argument of, say, Averroes. You know, you can, by using reason, Aristotelian reason, you can come to the knowledge of that there is a God, and he is one. And of course, this is shared by Jewish and Muslim accounts of God. And then the 4th book has to do with what we can know of God by revelation. That is triune, the Trinity. So on the one hand, three stores are built up on the basis of natural reason. And then the top 4th floor is built on the basis of divine revelation. And that captures Thomas's view. Very optimistic in terms of the capabilities of natural reason shared by all human beings. And then on top of that, you then have to add the elevation of natural reason in order to receive divine revelation. But up to the 3rd floor, it's a common ground.
Last night I went to the bookstore. I looked around, and there was a book with the title of which was something like "The Philosophical Foundations of the Christian Worldview." I won't name names. Does it sound Aristotle or
well, it depends on what
Aquinas?
Yeah, it depends on what kind of philosophical foundations. There are, of course, philosophical foundations, but if you understand with philosophical foundation the Aristotelian account, it may have been a Thomistic account of the philosophical foundation. Certainly, Thomas believed that in order to prove the existence of God, in order to prove that there is one God, you can work with natural reason. If you want to know him as a Trinitarian God, then you have to be open to revelation. But as far as that there is a God and he is one, natural reason, as Aristotle understood it, is your guide.
It sounds like classical apologetics, where you prove the existence of God based on reason, and then the Christian revelation comes.
Even in the other Summa, the Summa Theologiae, he talks about the reality of God as in a twofold way. The first part has to do with the Deo Uno, that God is one. And then you find the 5 ways proving the existence of God, the famous arguments, not original from Thomas, because Anselm had also used some of them, not all the 5 ways, but at least 4. And the Deo Uno, that God is one, is something that God exists and God is one, is something that you can access to via reason. And then he has the Deo Trino, God as triune. And then he says you need divine revelation. So that is the way in which he argues for his doctrine of God.
Now, I think you write about the fact that it's not just the existence, but certain characteristics or attributes of God that can be proven according
Some
to
attributes
Aquinas.
are also, according to Thomas, reachable and accessible via reason. That God is eternal, that God is infinite, that God is simple. Yeah, these are philosophical ways of accounting the reality of God that we share with all human beings. So if we reason well and remove the obstacles that we can have in our journey in using human reason, Thomas is confident that we can find agreement on that with Muslims, with Jews, with pagans. All of them using the same natural reason. That is a propriety of all human beings.
You often hear people say that Aquinas baptized Aristotle. I mean, not
that's
in
a metaphor.
metaphorical sense.
Yes.
Is this an accurate metaphor?
Well, that Aristotle was the main philosopher that had emerged in the 12th and 13th century. So everybody doing university studies, academic scholarship at that time, in one way or another, had to do with Aristotle if he wanted to keep his post as a university lecturer, because he had become the main paradigm for philosophy, the sciences, and therefore theology. And universities that had been founded in the 12th century, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, they were all trying to have the theology departments attached to the universities. And so they wanted to accredit themselves as scientific topics and fields. And so Aristotle was the philosopher to deal with. So Thomas was the one who had this very important task before him, to try to grapple with Aristotle in such a way that, according to Thomas, his intention was to show the common ground between the philosophical account of Aristotle and the Christian account of reality, and therefore opening a space, a spot for theology in the university context. That is a matter of controversy. Did Thomas baptize Aristotle, or was he baptized by Aristotle? In the attempt of Christianizing Aristotle, did he actually paganize Christianity?
What do you think?
Well, you have to read the book. No. Yeah. I think that, put it in this polarized way is a rather simplistic way. Certainly, the intention of Thomas was not to paganize Christianity. That is obvious. To what extent was he successful? I think that his intention was not to paganize Christianity. In my view, he conceded too much for a proper biblical Christian reinterpretation of Aristotle to take place. He conceded too much.
How was it different from the Platonizing tendency of earlier centuries?
Yeah, in very simplistic categories, people often say, in a way, what Thomas did paralleled with what Augustine did in the 4th century. Augustine tried to grapple with Platonism. That was the main framework. That was the main discourse. That was the main philosophical grid. And Christians had to use Platonic or Neoplatonic sources and categories. And Augustine tried to. Now, to what extent he was successful, that's a matter of debate. Thomas, 8 centuries after, with this changed situation, and having Aristotelianism become the main philosophical grid, he tried to do something parallel, trying to help Christian theology, Christian thought, to grapple with this new framework. And was he successful? If we can stretch the parallel even beyond Thomas, you can find, after the Enlightenment, liberalism, theological liberalism, was a way to try to grapple with the new philosophical grid that emerged out of the Enlightenment. Was it successful? Probably not. It was more of a compromise. Now we're grappling with another paradigm. Call it modernity postmodernity, liquid thinking, whatever. And theology, again, needs to do its homework again, saying, are we grappling with the paradigm of the time? Is it faithful to Scripture? Is it compromising Christianity? That's
or responding to challenge.
Oh, yes. So every age, in a sense, has to do what Thomas did in his own age. No longer with Aristotelianism. That is no longer the main paradigm.
So could he use Aristotle, or is it a plausible interpretation that he used Aristotle as an apologetic instrument, like when you use Jordan Peterson today, for example?
Well, that's why I said, in my view, in my assessment, he conceded too much. One thing is just to pick up a quote or to use pagan authors to. You have it in the Bible. Paul did it in the Areopagus. He quoted a poet, but he didn't endorse. He didn't say, he's not just. You don't have to take him just as a fancy quote, a thoughtful thought, an insightful thought. Aquinas did more than that. He actually embraced Aristotle's logic, Aristotle's ontology, with making sure that Aristotle was not a creationist, and Thomas was. Aristotle didn't believe in a living God, but Thomas did. So, provided that we are careful not to oversimplify things, but he conceded too much. And so he took the system, Aristotelianism, and tried to prove that for most parts, that was not only compatible, but even foundational for Christianity, for a thoughtful, academic presentation and commendation of Christianity. We are all dealing with other pagan authors, philosophers, and that is part of every theological work. The point is, to what extent do we drink from their presuppositions, from their assumptions, to what extent we buy into their worldview and try only to put a Christianized color on it, while assuming that the basic architecture is something that we can use. That is something of a contentious issue.
What do you think of the hypothesis that maybe Thomas Aquinas had this inner conflict between a Neoplatonic Christianity and Aristotelian Christianity, and in his mystical experience, he fell back on a Neoplatonic approach?
Well, you should write a book on Thomas Aquinas, because that's a very, very interesting hypothesis. One thing I want to say in this regard is that we often associate Thomas with Aristotle or in Aristotelianism. Thomas is more complex than that. There is certainly an Aristotelian strand that is driving his intellectual enterprise, but it's just one. Then you have the Neoplatonic driving force. Augustine, Boethius, and especially Dionysius.
I was surprised by that.
Yes.
Reading it
you study on the divine names of Dionysius, the Areopagite. That's another stream. And then he was a biblical scholar. Thomas was a biblical scholar. He didn't know Hebrew, and apparently he didn't know Greek. So I have to carefully qualify when I say he was a biblical scholar. In his own time, in his own way, but neither Augustine knew Hebrew, by the way. So, and he was a great church father. But
Was not good at Greek either.
He was not good at Greek. Yes, that's right. But he wrote commentaries on many of the biblical books. That doesn't mean that if you write a commentary, you're writing according to a proper understanding of Scripture. But it only means that thinking of Thomas as just having Aristotle in his mind is a reduction. He had several strands, and he's playing with several influences. Aristotle is certainly one thing, big one, but also the Neoplatonic tradition, and he tries to, because he's aware of the fact that he stands on a tradition that precedes him. So he doesn't want to reinvent Christianity from scratch, but he wants to adapt the received tradition in the context of the emergence of this Aristotelian paradigm. He wants them to further that adaptation process, not starting from scratch, but starting from Neoplatonism, Augustinianism, Peter Lombard, Dionysius the Areopagite, and so on and so forth, bringing all this tradition and grappling with Aristotelianism and resulting in the Summa. The Summa is the outcome.
Which one?
The second one,
Second.
Summa Theologiae. The Summa is the outcome of this impressive enterprise, wanting to update, in a sense, Christianity's credentials, not only reiterating the traditional synthesis, but also updating them as to encounter the challenges of the day.
I brought a quotation from Leslie Newbigin, which I want to ask you about, which is related to what you have just said. Leslie Newbigin says, "The Thomist scheme puts asunder what Augustine had held together, and as a result of this, knowledge is separated from faith. There is a kind of knowledge for which one does not have to depend on faith, and there is another kind which is only available by the exercise of faith. Certain knowledge is one thing, faith is something else." Do you think he's right?
Yeah, I think he's right. That is the limitation, and perhaps if I may dare, the mistake made by Thomas, too optimistic on the capacity and the faculties of human reason, as if the noetic effects of sin, the impact of sin on the operation of reason, and therefore the operation of the will and the operation of us as human beings, had only had a limited impact. That is what I think is the crux of the matter. He undermined or underestimated the impact of sin on the volition, on the cognitive, on the ability of human reason to grasp divine realities, and he put too much optimistic hope in human reason. And unlike Augustine was rather a pessimist when it came, a biblical pessimist, or I would say a biblical realist, when it came to the capability, affirming the capabilities of reason. You need, outside of grace, those capabilities are flawed, and you cannot really rely on them, even in proving anything about God, unless they are touched by divine grace, and therefore they are open to receive divine revelation. That is the more realist Augustinian way. The Thomistic way is more optimistic, saying, yes, there is sin, of course, as a place. He has a chapter on sin in the Summa Theologiae. Not in the early chapters. You have to go through not even the first book, not even the second book, not even the second part of the second book. You have to travel a long way before you encounter sin in the Summa. And that, architecturally speaks volumes of the fact that you can go 2/3 of the Summa and there is no reference to sin. And yet he has built a great amount of theological truths. The existence of God, the attributes of God, the reality of God, human creation, and so on and so forth. Then you have sin. But it's too far for realizing the importance of sin in the overall economy of a biblical worldview.
I think you make a very strong argument for this in the book. My question was, when I was reading you, whether we can make a similar mistake at the other end of the spectrum. And I remember reading in Calvin's Institutes that he made a distinction, referring to Augustine, that he borrowed that distinction from Augustine, how the human mind was affected by sin related to heavenly things and earthly things. And both Augustine and Calvin, agreeing with Augustine, say that the faculties of the human mind are completely destroyed when it comes to heavenly things, but are not totally destroyed when it comes to earthly things.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and then later developments that call that common grace, or but Thomas would not agree with that. He would stretch his optimistic expectations on human reason as to address also the heavenly. Mm-hmm. And he would say that the way in which human reason can access divine realities is limited, in need to be supplemented by divine revelation and divine light. But limited doesn't mean, it means operative, effective, and to a certain extent, truthful and reliable. It's only limited, whereas Augustine and Calvin would have said, as far as the divine realities are concerned, human faculties, and therefore human reason, is totally unreliable and incapable even of...
Dead, in a sense.
Yeah, they're dead. They're dead. Whereas in Thomas's account, sin is more of a wound. It's more of a limitation that is part of the created nature of human reason. But more than a limit, it has become a wounded human reason, but still operating, still reliable to a lesser extent, but to a real extent. And that is, if you open the way to this, then you think of grace, revelation as something that needs to be added to nature, to reason, in order for reason and nature to be elevated. So Christianity becomes an elevation of our human condition rather than a regeneration. And there is a continuity between nature and grace. Nature is limited, it is also tainted by sin, but needs to be elevated. And grace brings human nature, reason, humanity to an elevated order. Whereas I argue that the biblical account cannot be reduced to this ontological ladder. There is the ground level and there is the upper level. The biblical framework talks about a good creation, fallen into sin, redeemed. And it's more of an historical flow rather than an ontological ladder. That is what, in a way, Thomas did not in a badly. He assumed the ontological primacy over the historical, moral flow of biblical Christianity. And once you enter the ontological route, you're stuck in it because you're grappling with
Pope Francis. You end up with Pope Francis.
Yeah, you end up in Pope Francis, but you also end up in John Paul II, Faith and Reason, Fides and Ratio. Basically, in 1999, that encyclical, Faith and Reason, basically representing Thomas as a model for thinking the relationship between faith and reason. Reason is a very good and reliable human resource. Faith is what makes reason go to the upper level. Instead of saying reason, even outside of grace, because it's fallen, can lead you to a very limited use in terms of these earthly affairs, but without the divine intervention, without divine revelation, without grace, is incapable, or actually is confused. And Romans 1 and 2, it's contradictory. It doesn't know. It has no compass. It can contradict itself. It's not a reliable guide.
I almost asked the question, do you think contemporary Molinists and Arminians have this classical approach and do something similar to Aquinas? But I remembered R.C. Sproul, who put Aquinas in the monergist camp as opposed to the Semite-Pelagians. So he thought Aquinas was with Augustine and Calvin and Jonathan Edwards in the same camp. So let's talk about the reception history of Aquinas. I think one of the most helpful parts of your book was the different tracts. So how Catholics received Aquinas and how Protestants received Aquinas, and both are really exciting, both tracts. So why don't we start with the Catholic ones and then get to the Protestant and then the evangelical tracts?
Yes. Well, Thomas was a master, and so he was the initiator of a school. If you're talking about Thomism, it means that he was not only confined to his own person, but out of him, a multi-generational interest in his thought was generated, and is still very vibrant. And so, when we deal with Thomas, we are not only dealing with the amount of his work, but also we are dealing with an ongoing reception of his work. Commentators writing on individual books of Thomas, commentators debating about the right interpretation of Thomas, entire schools, universities, academic projects shaped by the commitment to defend and promote Thomas. And that has been going on since his death up to now. And there are varieties of Thomism. If you look at the 14th century, 15th century, 16th century, if you look at Germany, Spain, France, Italy, if you look at philosophy, theology, if you look at various doctrinal topics, and it's a universe that no one really grasps in its entirety because of its vastness. But one thing, and then you have Thomas at the end of the 19th century being elevated to the supreme model of Catholic thinking, the Aeterni Patris, the encyclical by Leo XIII, 1879. Thomas, the Catholic Church at the end of the 19th century, being confronted by modernity, being confronted by the Enlightenment, being confronted by the French Revolution, being confronted by all the trends coming from the modern world, wanted to have a model that would be helpful in trying to defend the Catholic faith and to respond to the challenges. And Thomas, by Leo XIII, was elevated to the supreme model. And that's at the end.
Is it an infallible statement?
Well, it's an encyclical, not infallible. It's after the dogma of papal infallibility, but not given the infallible the infallibility status. But Paul then, Pope Paul the Sixth, John Paul II, Benedict, they're all reiterating this huge high esteem of Thomas. And
did they call themselves Thomists?
John Paul II would call himself a Thomist. Benedict would be more in line with the Augustinian tradition within Catholicism. Francis is very eclectic. He would not be classifiable into any schools. But certainly Thomas has had and still has a very the highest regard as the principal, the main shaper and builder, defender of the Catholic faith. And that has been, the trajectory of the Catholic reception of Thomas, and still going on in many ways, still very alive as a tradition. But this is the point. Catholic Thomism implies that you embrace Thomas's system. It's not a pick and choose exercise. It's not cherry picking.
Not even for the new theology, because there are a few pages on that.
Yeah, the new theology is retrieving Thomas because they felt that Thomas during the 19th century was too heavily categorized, made it rigid, made it into a rigid static scheme, and losing the nuances, the elasticity, the grays around, the gray areas around his thought. And so they wanted to retrieve that aspect in Thomas rather than in subsequent interpretations of Thomas. But they basically are going back to Thomistic categories like the analogy and the doctrine of participation, reinterpreting them in the light of modern current trends. There's a very interesting, I think I make reference to it in the book, a very interesting reading of Vatican II, so the latest council, which argues that the main theological architecture of Vatican II comes from Thomas. The doctrine of analogy, everything is close to something else. Nothing is far. What is emphasized is the proximity. And then the doctrine of participation. Not only everything is next to the other, but everything participates in one way or another in the other. So that if you apply these Thomistic categories, you end up in present-day Catholicism. Ecumenical, interfaith, embracing. Why? Because everything is in analogy with everything else. Christianity is an analogy with Islam. And so what is stressed is what is in common, not what is different. And they say this is an appropriation of Thomas's doctrine of analogy. Participation. We're no strangers. We're brothers. We're all brothers, by the way. That's Pope Francis. And that's Thomas. The doctrine of participation. We participate in the rest of the world. And so there is no stranger, there is no outsider, there is no reprobate, there is no one who is left out. Everyone is included.
So would Vatican II be a more legitimate interpretation or application of Thomas than Trent?
Yeah, there is an intense debate in even in Catholic circles as to what is the right interpretation of Thomas, and they're debating it. And there is a more rigid, scholastic or neo-scholastic way of interpreting Thomas. Thomas is this very squared, black and white, clear, consistent, predictable type of thinker. That's the neo-Thomistic. The Vatican II or Ressuscité interpretation of Thomas wants to see in Thomas this very Catholic theologian that encourages dialogue, encourages absorption, and he has the categories of coming close to everyone and everything because of this optimistic investment on human nature, human reason, human will, and that is very modern and even postmodern, because we're all, in a sense, we're all in the same boat, we're all close to one another, and in one way or another we participate in one another. No one can be told to be outside of the picture, and that is very Vatican II.
Yeah, did Thomas, or would Thomas apply this to the relationship between God and man as well? He
would have a clear distinction between the creator and the creature. In that sense, he's not a pagan thinker, theologian, but that distinction is then, in a way, blurred and weakened in his underestimated appreciation of sin. Because, yes, there is the distinction between the creator and the creature, but then if you have not a properly biblically defined doctrine of sin, then you attribute and ascribe to human nature, human being, something that is no longer there. And so some divine properties that are not there.
Let's turn to the Protestant and evangelical receptions of Aquinas, because I think that's probably the most interesting one for us. So I was surprised how diverse the reception was, even at the time of the Reformation or post-Reformation era. So can you tell us about that a little
let's
bit?
put it this way. Thomas lived 3 centuries before the Reformation. The Reformation was in many ways a reappropriation of biblical Christianity and also a reappropriation of a certain interpretation of the Father and the medieval fathers. So Thomas would be obviously part of that conversation. He had written the main textbook, and if we think of reformers like Martin Bucer, Peter Martyr Vermigli, they would have been trained on the Summa. Luther, no, there is no evidence that he actually read, let alone studied.
He was like Augustinian.
He was Augustine, he was on the other side. Calvin didn't have a theological formation, he was more of a jurist, a lawyer. So there is no evidence that he actually grappled with the Summa. But those who had gone through theological education had been trained on the Summa. So that was obvious because that was the theology of the time. So he was a dialogue partner along the way. In my study, I argue that there are two lines that need to be taken into consideration in studying the Protestant engagement with Thomas. On the one hand, I call it eclecticism, eclectic appropriations. On the other, I call it Hellenistic refutation. So the Reformers and the post-Reformation theologians, they moved in between these two lines, these two tracks. On the one hand, eclectically, selectively taking Thomas on certain topics, certain issues, certain debates, but never embracing his system. Never. Because that would have made them Catholic Thomists. The Catholics, on the other hand, could argue over the right interpretation of Thomas on single details, topics, and issues, while embracing Thomas as a whole.
So not even Bucer wanted to...
No, not at all, not at all. Bucer and the other reformers are very consistent in saying, we refute, I popularize, we refute Thomas when Scripture is not followed by him. So they were free to say, we follow Thomas insofar as he follows Scripture. But when he departs from it, Thomas is not our father, is not someone we would follow. In that sense, they would not embrace his system, and they would turn to the more Hellenistic attitude. Hellenistic means refuting, debating, showing, undermining, showing the error, no? So eclectically appropriating Thomas, because he was the main theological textbook for many centuries, but also Hellenistically refuting him, when embracing Thomas would have meant going against Scripture. It was Scripture who exercised the foundational, primary, ultimate epistemic authority. So Thomas, they could, and that's the same thing that they did with the fathers. It's not something different. Of course, Thomas was the nearest medieval father, writing in a systematic way, and so they had to grapple with him. But the same attitude was followed with regards to Augustine, with regards to Peter Lombard, with regards to the Cappadocians, with regards to Boetius, and many others, between eclectic and Hellenic, and governed by this attempt at submitting every thought to Christ as the Scriptures teaching.
Has it become more negative, the attitude toward Aquinas after Trent?
Yes, because Trent used Thomas as its giant, and with the picture is very symbolic and very powerful. At the Council of Trent, when the bishops were discussing and were deciding to anathemize the Protestants, they had the Vulgate on the table at the center of the room. They had the Bible, the Vulgate in the Latin version, and they had the Summa open. So the Bible, as interpreted by Thomas, that was their symbolic consensus. And the Reformers, after Trent, they understood that Thomas was used against the major foundational doctrines of the Reformation: faith alone, Christ alone, grace alone, Scripture alone. All these alones are, in a way, contrary to Thomas, are against Thomas, because Thomas is because of what we said earlier on, he wants to affirm reason, he wants to affirm human nature. And so there is no way of having Thomas affirming a Scripture alone principle. He wants to affirm Scripture as well as Aristotle, as well as the Neoplatonic sources, as well as all other sources. And so there's no Scripture alone there. He wants to affirm faith, but it's never faith alone, because together with faith, he wants to affirm the role of reason, the role of natural light, the role of human endeavors. There's no faith alone. And you can argue that there's not even Christ alone, because Thomas was also instrumental. He didn't invent Mariology or Mariological doctrine. He just endorsed it and gave it a more systematic presentation. So, and even the saints, he was we were talking about Thomas as a contemplative. He had, in his view, he had the saints interceding for him and him interceding for the dead. So he was very part of that mystical tradition that was contrary to the faith alone of the Reformation.
So in the most significant questions or debates of the time of the Reformation, he was on the other side.
He was on the other side.
Now, you mentioned some Protestant thinkers who did not think that, and it's on page 103, where you mentioned Dorsche, I think that's how it's pronounced, who wrote, he was a professor of theology in Strasbourg, and in 1656 he published the book, and here's the title: Thomas Aquinas, called the Angelic Doctor, shown to be a confessor of the evangelical truth that was repeated in the Augsburg Confession.
Yeah.
So what do you make of
No,
that?
he was never considered to be a serious work.
Okay.
I mean, he wanted to, he projected onto Thomas his own Lutheran...
For apologetic reasons.
Purposes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But the Catholics dismissed him from the very beginning, and the Lutherans too. They said, "Wait, you went way beyond Thomas. It's a wishful thinking."
Okay, that brings us to the contemporary world, where there is a strange renaissance of Aquinas among evangelicals in evangelical circles. So, what's the reason behind this phenomenon?
I think there are several factors to be taken into consideration, and the things are still moving. So we're not yet in the position of coming to the end of this analysis, but we're living in an age of epistemological turmoil, cultural turmoil, shifts in worldviews, things going upside down, and Thomas symbolically, ideally, ideologically represents something of a stable, traditional account of Christianity, where everything moves around. Thomas appears to be a solid, stable reference point. And many times Thomas's thought is compared to the cathedrals. You know, there are ruins around, but the cathedrals are still, it has an emotional, psychological effect. We want to attach ourselves to something stable while everything else moves on. Now, the problem is that instead of going back to Scripture, that is the only rock, and Christ, who is the rock, as the solid ground we can stand on, there is this strange phenomenon whereby we are going back to Thomas to find that security, cogency, stability. That is one thing. The other thing is that there is a selective reading of Thomas that has prioritized his so-called doctrine of God and the attributes of God, the defense of the divine attributes of God. And evangelicals, they have a blind spot, a blind eye with regards to Thomas's soteriology, Thomas's Mariology, Thomas's ecclesiology, Thomas's mysticism, Thomas's endorsement of everything that the Reformers rejected in the name of the recovery of Scripture alone. Evangelicals, they focus on Thomas's epistemology and the doctrine of God, while forgetting, and in doing so, they misunderstand Thomas. Thomas cannot be taken in slices. I mean, there is a sense in which eclecticism can pick and choose, can cherry picking in Thomas's thought. But that's a different thing than saying Thomas's doctrine of God and Thomas's doctrine of the knowledge of God are healthy, are reliable. Everything else we don't know. That is not very, from the scholarly point of view, very accurate. Because Thomas's thought cannot be taken in slices. If you have his doctrine of God, he uses the doctrine of God to argue for his Mariology, for his ecclesiology, for his doctrine of the sacraments, for his doctrine of salvation. The system is interconnected. There is no safe space, and then all the rest is...
How is it different from appropriating Augustine or parts of Augustine, like taking his doctrine of grace, but not his doctrine of the church.
Yeah. Augustine was an unresolved theologian, and he himself admits that. At the end of his life, he wrote the retractationes, the things that he wanted to correct. So he, at the end of his life, very, very, in a transparent way, in a humble way, very few people would do that. At the end of, after a career as a bishop and so, he wrote a book saying, I was wrong on this, I was wrong on that, I was wrong on that, I'm not sure on this, I'm not sure on that.
Whereas Aquinas wanted to burn the whole thing.
Yeah, he wanted to burn the whole thing, but Augustine is an unresolved thinker. And B.B. Warfield, at the end of the 19th century, I think he captures what is at stake with Augustine. Augustine had two twins in his womb. He compares Augustine with a mother, and he has two twins, doctrine of grace and the doctrine of the church. And in his womb, they are unresolved. They're fighting with one another. They're two distinct twins, and they're fighting. And so Warfield says, the Reformation, in claiming Augustine, made the doctrine of grace to come out earlier. So the doctrine of grace is the firstborn, and then the doctrine of the church. Catholicism did the other way around, took the doctrine of the church and prioritized it over the doctrine of grace. But Augustine is this unsettled thinker on many issues. Thomas is not. Thomas is much more a systematic thinker. Thomas has built a system of thought, and it's very carefully argued, and is very carefully connected, interconnected, so that whereas you can appropriate Augustine and realizing that other parts of Augustine were not consistent. Now, you have to take responsibility to do that, of course. But with Thomas, that exercise is not possible. You either embrace him in his system, or you choose to do what the Reformers did, cherry picking as far as he was close to Scripture, but never embracing the system. That is something that evangelical neo-Thomists or people who are enamored with Thomas not always understand, in my view. They want to embrace Thomas because they are afraid that the culture is going bankrupt, and they think that Thomas provides this stable platform. And I don't think he's a good ally in that. I don't know if the remedy is better than the evil they want to address.
Will you write your next book on Augustine?
I don't know.
I'd certainly be interested in it.
Okay.
Just in 30 seconds, what advice would you give to evangelicals when it comes to Aquinas?
It is to try to appreciate what our forefathers did with him. Reading him, always reading it carefully, critically, in the light of Scripture, and being free and able to side with him when he's right and he's referring to the Bible, and distancing from him, but never embracing the system, never talking about evangelical Thomism or Protestant Thomism, because that is a contradiction in terms, in my view.